Hello and welcome to the next video in the Kilpin Knitting Club series. This one's going to be a little bit different because I'm going to do the first knitting pattern walkthrough. As Emily suggested, I'm going to do this heart pattern, which I'm going to start doing a few hearts to send off to York Hospital so they can give one heart to a person who has sadly died of coronavirus, and they will give the other matching heart to a member of their family. I had a look through this pattern and I actually think it's a great pattern to start with because it uses all the same skills that we've already looked at in the previous lessons, and it's a pretty simple, straightforward project to start with, and the pattern's also really easy to follow, so I think it's a great place to start. The best thing to do with a knitting pattern when you find one is to have a good read of it first to check that you have all the equipment that you need, and if there's any new skills that you need to teach yourself before you embark on the project, that you can go away and learn those before you get started on the project. So in the introduction of a knitting pattern, you'll always have a list of things that you need, any notes that you need to be aware of, any particular skills you need to learn, and it will also have a list of abbreviations to tell you when they use abbreviations in the pattern, what they mean. So this is the knitting pattern that Emily directed me to, which I found on Ravelry, and it was free. It was just a PDF that I've downloaded. So it tells you that you need a pair of 3.75mm straight knitting needles. I think the needles I've given you guys are between 4 and 5 centimeters. I think the needles I've given you guys are between 4 and 5mm, but for a project like this, it shouldn't matter that much, as long as they're in the same sort of ballpark. The needle size matters more for things that you want them to be a specific size, like an item of clothing. This is a three-dimensional heart, so it does need some toy stuffing inside it. If you don't have any, don't worry. You could use something like cotton wool. You could leave them empty, I suppose. I haven't got any toy filling, but I do have some polystyrene balls that you would use to fill a Beanie Baby or a beanbag, so I've just used some of those. You'll also need a darning or tapestry needle, which is a fairly large sewing needle, which you're going to use to sew the pieces together and to sew your ends in. You also needed a stitch holder. Now this is a little bit like a big paper clip that you use to hold your stitches in place while you work on other bits of the project. So you often find this in patterns like this where you've got sections that split off from each other, like the top of the heart shape is split into two. So the stitch holder will hold your stitches in place while you're knitting the other half. This is important because if you don't hold the stitches in place with either a knitting needle or a stitch holder or something else, the whole thing will just unravel, because until you've cast off, those stitches are not finished. You can buy these on the internet pretty easily. They come in lots of different sizes depending on how many stitches you want to hold on them at any one time. This is quite a small pattern, so you will only need a small one. If you have a regular safety pin, you could use one of those as well if it was big enough. But of course, be careful because stitch holders aren't sharp, whereas a safety pin will be a lot sharper. It also tells you here what yarn you need. So ideally we want to be doing these in either pink or red, but any colour will do, especially if you're just practicing. In bigger patterns, you may need to use more than one ball. Something like a jumper would require 3 or 4 balls of wool, and the pattern will tell you what colours you should use and how many balls you're going to need of those. In the notes here, it tells us that the project's going to finish at about 6.5 centimeters by 6.5 centimeters. It's going to be knitted on straight knitting needles, and it's going to be knitted flat. And what that means is you're just going to be making one straight flat piece of knitting rather than knitting in the round, which is what we did last time on the circular knitting needles. Tension is very important. This is sometimes referred to as gauge or stitch gauge. This tells you how many stitches and rows you should have in a certain area, and it's a way of making sure that your finished project is going to end up being the right size. In this particular pattern, it tells you that you want to have 22 stitches and 28 rows in a 10 by 10 square. A 10 by 10 square or 4 by 4 inch square is a fairly standard stitch gauge. What that's telling you is if you want the pattern to end up the right size, you need to have 22 stitches and 28 rows in that square. For something like this project, we don't need to worry about it too much, because if your hearts end up being slightly bigger or slightly smaller, it won't matter. But for something like an item of clothing, this is quite important because you want to make sure that the pattern is going to end up being the right size when you've finished it. The best thing to do on a bigger project like that, where you're worried about the stitch gauge or the tension, is to do a gauge square. And this is essentially a square of knitting which is larger than 10 by 10 centimeters, knitted using the same wool and the same needles that you intend to use for your project. So what I would recommend you do is, for example, if we were going to do a gauge square for this pattern, you would cast on approximately twice as many stitches as it looks for. So I would do 44 stitches, and then knit in stockingette stitch, which is knit one way, purl the other, which is what we were doing on our practice square. And do that until you've got roughly twice as many rows. So in this case, it would be 56 rows because it wants 28. The reason we do more is because we don't want the edges to be part of that 10 by 10 square, because they're never going to be quite right. You just want a nice sample of the middle of your knitting without the edges being involved in it. So you're going to end up with a piece that's going to be probably about 4 times the size that you're looking for, but you want that 10 by 10 centimetre square to be sitting in the middle. So it'll give you a realistic view of how many stitches and rows you'll end up with. Tension varies from person to person because it's to do with how you hold the wool and how you hold the needles. So the best thing to do is, if you do a gauge square and you find that your tension is off, so maybe you've got too few or too many stitches and rows, the best thing you can do is to change your needle size. You're never going to be able to change your own personal tension because that's too difficult to change. It's habitual to you, it's how you've learned to knit, it's how you've practiced, and you'll never be able to make it consistent if you try and change that. And again, you could also change the yarn that you're using, because if you use thicker or thinner yarn, it'll make a difference to your stitch gauge. But if you're really intending to use this yarn for this particular project, you might not want to change your yarn because you might have had your heart set on that particular colour or texture. So the best thing you can do is change the size of your needles. If you've ended up with too few stitches or rows in that 10 by 10 square, then it means your needles are too big. So you need to go down a size. If you've ended up with if you've ended up with too many stitches and rows in that square, it means your needles are too small and you need to go up a size. This is why, if you get into knitting, it's a good idea to have a selection of different sizes available to you, so you're able to go up and down a size pretty easily if you find that your stitch tension is a little bit off. But as I said, for this particular pattern, we don't have to worry about that too much. So I'm not going to bother doing a tension a gauge square because we don't need to. I'm not worried about it. In this particular pattern, the casting on is a different cast on from the one that we've done before. So this is a new skill for me. I've never done casting on this way. It says use the long tail cast on, which is not the one we learned in the video a few weeks ago. It's a different one. So I've looked up a video of how to do it on YouTube. I'll share that link with you, but I'm also going to, as part of this lesson, I'm going to show you how to do it as well. It's a different cast on from the one we learned, and I actually think it's a bit better. So I might be using it in the future for my future projects. And then this project has some seams that we have to sew up. So once we've knitted our heart shape, we're going to have to sew the edges together. And we're going to use mattress stitch to do that. Here we have a table of abbreviations. Most abbreviations you find in knitting patterns are pretty standard, and you'll find the same ones used again and again. Things like K and P for knit and purl. It's fairly self-explanatory. Knit 2 together, or K2 tog, is one of the decreases that we learned in the last lesson. That's where you put your needle into 2 stitches instead of 1 and then knit them together to decrease from 2 stitches to 1. M1 means make 1, and that's the increase we learned in the previous lesson. So go back to the previous video if you need a reminder of how to do those. Pull through to cast off is a different casting off from the one we learned. It's not really a stitch in its own right. What we're really doing is, once you've got to the end of the project, you're just going to thread your needle, thread your sewing needle with your yarn all the way through those stitches and then pull the needle out. So rather than finishing those stitches off, you're just going to put a strand of yarn through them all and then take the needle out. So you haven't really finished them, they're just going to be sitting in place with this yarn in the middle. I'll show you how to do that as well, but it's a lot easier than trying to cast off the traditional way. Repeat is very common in knitting patterns because there'll be a lot of repeated sections, whether it's repeated stitches or maybe it's repeated rows. So repeat is very common. A knitting pattern will point out which is the right side and wrong side of your knitting. I've mentioned this before, but the right side is the bit that people are going to see. So whether it's the outside of a stuffed toy, if it's the outside of a jumper, that's the right side. Typically that's made up of knit stitches, but you can get more complex patterns that have got mixtures of stitches in there. And the wrong side typically is made of purl stitches. And that's the bit that's facing inwards that people won't see. SSK is slip, slip, knit, and that's the other decrease that we learned, but helpfully this pattern gives you a bit of a reminder of what that is. ST is stitches. And then we've got two different types of brackets here. Square brackets indicates there's a section of the pattern you need to repeat. And then you've got rounded brackets, which will tell you at the end of each row how many stitches you should have ended up with, which is really helpful to keep track of how many stitches you've done. And if it doesn't match up, it means you've done something wrong. Here's my heart that I made. I made this yesterday. It's not terribly neat and tidy, but it was my first attempt. And you can see it's a three-dimensional heart. This was originally one piece that I made using the pattern. And it was folded backwards on itself. So it was folded backwards here and here. And then you can see there's a seam down the back. If it's sewed more neatly than I've done it, you will barely be able to see that seam, but you can because I've not done it very neatly. And then it's all gathered together here at the bottom. And I have filled this with some polystyrene balls. Might be able to hear it because I didn't have any toy stuffing. I think that'll do. But yeah, this is the heart that we're going to make with this pattern. Something wrong. Let's take a look at the pattern. So the first instruction is that we have to cast on using that method that it was talking about earlier, and I'll show you how to do that. I'm going to cast on 6 stitches, so not many. So now I'm going to make a new heart with this rather fetchingly bright red wool that I found in my collection. And I'm going to firstly show you how to do the long tail cast on, which was a new skill to me, and I'm going to put the link to the YouTube video where I learned it from into this at some point. Now I'm going to use these needles. You might recognise these if I've given you some of these. These are the kids' needles that I bought. I'm using these because it's not a very big project and I don't want to be using big unwieldy knitting needles. It's nice to have the choice. These are not 3.75, which is what the pattern asks for. They're 4, but I think that's close enough. I don't actually have any 3.75s, I don't think. But it's close enough. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put a slip knot in the wool, same as we did last time. But because we're going to use the long tail cast on, as the name suggests, we want to have quite a long tail to do it with, because when we're doing this cast on, we're actually using the wool from the tail to do the cast on and not the end of the wool that's attached to the ball. So we want to make sure it's quite long. I've got about, what, 25 centimetres there. And then we're going to do a slip knot, which is the same way that I showed you how to do it before. We just put a knot in it and we pull the long end of the wool through to complete the knot, and then pop that onto one of the needles. Alright, I'm going to put this needle down because to do this cast on you're going to need one needle in your hand. Alright, so I'm also going to put my ball of wool to my right over here because it needs to be on the right to do this. And I'm going to make sure I've got the I keep calling it the short end, but it's not that short. I'm going to put the short end to the left, and then this long end that's attached to the ball on my right here. So, here goes. With your right hand, just put your thumb lightly on that slip knot to keep it in place. Most of the work you're going to do here is with your left hand. I found this especially tricky because I'm right-handed, but we have to do it with our left hand, apparently. So, use your index finger and middle finger to get hold of the working yarn, which is the side on the right that's attached to your ball of wool. Use your thumb to grab hold of the short end, and then finally use your ring finger and your little finger to grip onto that. So let me just repeat that. So use your index finger and your middle finger to get hold of the long end, which is attached to the ball here. Use your thumb to loop the short end around like this, and then use your ring finger and little finger to grip in place. So you're using all of your fingers and your thumb here. Then use your needle, put it all the way to the bottom of all of these threads that you've got, loop it under this, so this bit that's at the bottom here, on the front of your thumb, pick it up, make sure it's at the front here, pop it under the other side, so this is the bit that's being held onto by your index finger and ring finger, and then pull it through the loop that you've made there, and then let go and pull both sides of your wool, and it'll go tight and it'll make
another stitch. So now I've got 2 on there. The slip knot was the first one, and now I've got another one. I'll show you that again. So get hold of the long end attached to your ball with your index finger and middle finger. Use your thumb to pick up the short end, and then use your ring finger and little finger to hold it in place like that, and then use your thumb of your right hand here just to hold everything in place here. So then put your needle right to the bottom underneath this bit here, pick it up, use your needle to pick up this bit of wool here, and then pull it through the loop that you had on your thumb, and then drop it and then pull it tight. You might need to keep trying, don't worry. If this is only a practice, so you can just keep practicing. I am going to put the link to the video where I learned this on the YouTube video as well. You might find that a bit easier to follow. I'm not an expert at doing these. Be patient with yourself. It took me quite a few attempts to get hold of this. I'll show you again. So use your index finger and middle finger to pick up the long bit of yarn on the right that's attached to the ball. Use your right thumb to just hold all your stitches in place. Use your left thumb to pick up this bit of wool here, which is the short end, and then use your ring finger and little finger just to sort of hold it in place there. Alright, use your needle to pick up this thread here to make a loop, and then pick up this bit here, pull it through the loop, and then pull on both sides of your wool to tighten it. Have a go, keep practicing, and I'll see you back here when I've got 6 of these on my needle, which is what the pattern asks for.
I'm going to use the 3.75mm needles that it mentioned, or whatever needles you happen to be using. We're going to start at the very bottom of the heart shape, and then we'll go through row by row. Sometimes in knitting patterns you find it will ask you to repeat a section of rows. This pattern doesn't have an awful lot of those because we're increasing and decreasing fairly rapidly to make our heart shape. But in something that's a bit bigger, like perhaps a scarf or a jumper, you'll have rows that you will do again and again and again to make the size of the project. And it will tell you that in the pattern. So here we're just going to follow through sequentially, row 1, row 2, row 3, and so on. Row 1 is pretty easy. That just says purl, P, 6 stitches. So that means once you've purled those 6 stitches that you cast on, you'll still have 6 stitches because you've not increased or decreased any, and you're on the wrong side because you've just done a purl. If you haven't ended up with 6 stitches, you've done something wrong.
And then we're just going to purl. So we're going to pop our needle in like this, and we're going to keep purling. Off. There we are. Something to watch out for, which I've not mentioned before, is when you're knitting and purling and whatever it is you're doing, is just to be careful that you're not putting your needle through your wool. So when you're putting your needle through your loops and stitches and things to do your stitches, just make sure you're not actually putting your needle through the yarn, because it's made up of several layers of thread that are all woven together. So it can be quite easy to put your needle through those threads by accident. Oops. It's not a huge problem if you do on occasion, but it does make your knitting a little bit untidy, because you've not actually got your stitches completed with full sets of wool. It's, you've got stitches that are actually through bits and pieces. And it can make it quite difficult if you need to unravel it for any reason or unpick it, because you've not actually got full pieces of wool to work with anymore. You've just got Then
if we go to row 2, this has got some repeated sections and some increases in there. So because these sections are in square brackets, you can tell that they're intended to be repeated, and it will tell you how many times to repeat it. So in those first square brackets, we've got a knit 1 and then a make 1, and you're going to repeat that twice because it says ×2 afterwards. Then we've just got a K2, knit 2, so the next 2 stitches you would just do a knit in each one. That's not repeated because it's not in any square brackets. Then we've got another repeated section, which again we're going to repeat twice because it says ×2. And then it tells you that by the time you've done all that, you should end up with 10 stitches, because we started with 6 and we've done 4 increases in total, because there's a make 1 in each of those repeated sections and you've repeated them twice, so you should have ended up with 4 extra stitches. So it's a good idea to keep track of how many stitches you're doing. For a small pattern like this, you might be able to keep track in your head, You can also just look on your needle and count them individually. But for a bigger project, you might not want to rely on keeping track in your head. So you can use perhaps a notepad and pen and keep a tally of how many stitches and how many rows you've done. You can get an app on your phone that will do something similar to keep track.
So now I've done my 6 purl stitches along there, and I've got my work in my left hand again to do row 2. Now row 2 asks us to do a knit 1 and a make 1, and then repeat it twice. So first I'm going to knit into this first stitch here. It would seem. There we are. And then a make 1 we did in the last lesson, if you remember. That is where you will have a bar. Just put this to the back. You will have like a bar of wool in between the stitch we're about to do and the stitch we've just done here. I'm going to pop that over the top of my left hand needle, and we're going to knit into the back of it. So I'm going to use my left hand to just pull it open a little bit like that, and then pop the needle into the back and then knit into that as normal. There we go. So now I've got 2 stitches there on my right hand needle that I've just done, but I've still got 5 stitches left, so I've made 1. Okay, and then we're going to knit again. So I'm just going to do a normal knit in there, and then we're going to make 1 again. So this is this, just put that to the back, this strand here. I'll just show you again. That's this bit here, sitting in between the 2 stitches. I'm going to pull it open a little bit, put my needle in the back, and I'm going to knit it. Like so. Alright, now we've got 4 stitches. Now the next bit of the pattern just says to knit 2, so I'm just going to knit 2. Like so. And then it asks us to make 1 and then knit 1 and repeat it twice, so I'm going to do that. That's my make 1. And I'm just going to do a regular knit. And then I'm going to do another make 1. Oh, no, not managed to catch that one. And then finally, it tells us to just, and then do a knit, because I haven't done that bit. There we are. Whew. So now we've ended up with 10 stitches. I realise that orange needle and bright red wool are not the best resolution, but there we are. But we've ended up with 10 stitches. We've got 5 there and 5 there. Because we started with 6 and we've done 4 increases in there, and now we've ended up with 10.
And then row 3 is just purl into each of those 10 stitches that you've ended up with.
And we're just going to purl along the back. So row 3 is just a purl along the back here. And the other rows just go on in the same vein. Repeated sections of make 1 and knit 1. And then when you go on the wrong side, you're just purling all the way along. And as we're going along, I will count in my head how many stitches I've done to make sure that when I get to the end of the row, I've got the right number.
And it continues in a similar vein. We've got increases in almost every one of the knit rows here, because we're going to be increasing fairly rapidly to get to that heart shape. It carries on in that vein until we get to row 17, So row 17 wants you to use the stitch holder here. So it tells you to purl 17, which is, by the time we've got to this point, we've got 34 stitches. So you're going to purl 17, which is half of them, and then you're going to place the last ones onto a stitch holder. And that's where you're splitting off and doing the two halves of the top of the heart. And I will show you how to use a stitch holder to do that.
So now we're on to row 17. And you can see we're getting a rough sort of heart shape here. We've got a line of increases at about here on each side, and then another line of increases about here. So we're ending up with a sort of puffy looking shape. It doesn't look an awful lot like a heart at the moment, but we've got a pointed bit at the bottom where they've got fewer stitches, and then we get wider and wider. So now we're going to split into two. So I have already gone along and purled these first 17 stitches, which the pattern asks us to do, and then what we have to do after that is to put the remaining 17 stitches onto a stitch marker, which I conveniently have here. So this is a stitch marker. As I described earlier, it is basically a big safety pin. If you happen to have a safety pin at home that's large enough to do this with, feel free to do that, although be careful not to poke your fingers with it. So this just opens up like a safety pin. I'm just going to shuffle the stitches I've already done down my needle because I'm going to drop this needle, so I don't want them to fall off, so I'm just going to put them there. Yeah, I've dropped it, it's just going to hang there. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to pop, we're not going to knit them or anything, we're just going to transfer each of these 17 stitches onto the stitch holder. So the way we do that is I'm going to pop the stitch holder into these stitches, what we call purlwise. So if I was about to purl these stitches with a regular knitting needle, I'd be putting the needle into them that direction. So this is called purlwise, but I'm just going to slip them rather than knit them. So all I'm going to do is pull until it comes off, and then just keep repeating. Keep doing that. There we are. So all the stitches are gone off this needle, and these 17 stitches are all sitting here on my stitch holder. So I'm just going to clip that closed. So now what you'll end up with is half of your stitches on this stitch holder and half of your stitches are on the needle, ready to knit again. So you can knit onto these as normal now, just pretend these aren't here, they'll just be hanging here at the back. And we're going to follow the pattern along. Okay, so row 18 and row 19 just ask you to knit and then purl along these. So I'm not going to show you how to do those because we've done that before, so I will meet you back here when I've done that.
Once you've done that, you've then got some decreases in here. So you've got, on row 20, for example, you've got some K2 togs or knit two together, and you've got some slip slip knits as well. The reason you tend to use both of these in combination is because one leans one way and one leans the other. So if you want a nice symmetrical shape like a heart, you're going to use a combination of both of them, so you end up with a nice symmetrical look at the end. Okay,
so I've just done rows 18 and 19, which was just a row of knit and a row of purl. So now we're going to do row 20, which does have some decreases in it. The first stitch we're going to do is just a knit, so I'm going to do that. Then it wants us to do a knit two together. We've done that before, together. So you just put your needle into the stitches as if you're going to knit, but you're putting your needle through two stitches rather than just one, and then you're going to knit those. And then it wants us to knit three. So I'm going to do that. 1, 2, 3. And then it asks us to do a slip slip knit. We did this in the last video as well. Just as a recap, we're going to, rather than knitting first, we're going to slip our 2 stitches. Now this pattern advises us that we should slip the first one knitwise, so we're putting our needle into this stitch as if we're going to knit it, and then slip it off. And then the second one we should do purlwise. So that's what I'm going to do, is slip my needle into this second one purlwise and slip that off as well. So we've now got these 2 stitches here that we've not knitted, they're just slipped from the first needle. Then we're going to slip our left hand needle back into the front of those. They should be nice and loose because we've just slipped them, and then knit those that way. and just knit as normal. So that's a slip slip knit. Then we're going to do a knit 1. It's just an ordinary knit. And then a knit 2 together again. So that's just putting our needle into these stitches as if we're going to knit them, but we are going to knit them, but we're going to put the needle into both of those 2 stitches rather than just the one, and then knit those. Then it asks to knit 3, so I'm going to knit 3, 1, 2, 3, and then it asks us to slip slip knit again. Excuse me. So first one we'll do knitwise, second one we'll do purlwise, and slip, put that needle in there, and then knit those like so. And then the last one is just a knit. Yeah, so now we've done some decreases. So now we're going to be making this piece a bit smaller to finish off the heart shape. The next row, 21, is just a purl, so I would go along this row and just purl. And then row 22 is very similar to 20. It's got some knits and it's got the 2 different decreases that we've done. And then we'll pull through to cast off. So I will come back and show you how to do that. Alright, so I've just completed rows 21, which was just a purl across the back, and then row 22, which was another row that had some decreases in it. And now I'm going to show you how to pull through to cast off. First thing you'll want to do is cut your yarn. Now, for a project like this that's going to involve some sewing together of things, I like to leave my tail pretty long, because then you can straight away use that to start sewing your project together. So I'm going to leave this pretty long. Because we're going to pull through to cast off, you also need to make sure you've got enough of your tail to go through these stitches. So in this case we're only really looking at a couple of centimetres, but if it was a bigger project obviously you'd need to make sure you had more. So I'm just going to cut this, it's easier off the camera. And what you can't see me doing is threading the yarn I've just cut into a tapestry needle or a darning needle. Oh yeah, it's just easier than trying to do it in front of the camera. So I've got about a foot of a tail there. It's pretty long, but that's okay. I want it to be long so I can sew stuff together with it afterwards. And then I've threaded it onto a darning needle. We're going to do something very similar to what we did with the stitch holder. Except I'm going to do it this way around because you're supposed to do it with the right side facing you. This is the right side. So I'm going to do it with my left hand. I'm not left-handed, so this is not the easiest thing to do. But what we're going to do is shuffle the stitches on your needle towards the end, so they're really close to the end of your needle, and then take your darning needle or your tapestry needle with your working yarn in it, and go from left to right through the first stitch and pull it off the needle. And then take the needle and just pull it tight. So that stitch won't unravel now because we've got it attached to our yarn here. So the stitch isn't finished, we've just sort of left it half done, but because you've put a thread through it, it's not going to unravel. And then do the same thing with this one. This is especially good for projects where you want your cast off edge to be drawn together like a drawstring. And for this heart shape, that is exactly what we're going to be doing. It also gives you quite a lot of flexibility because with the cast off that I showed you how to do before, it does make your edge go a little bit stiff, whereas this is as flexible as you want it to be, really. Just be careful not to pull off more than one. Le voila! So we have just cast off. If we pulled that slack, you'll see that that's actually quite wide because it's still got a few stitches left on it, but like a drawstring we can pull it tight like that. So I'm just going to put my knitting needle down. And then what I recommend you do here is just turn your work over, so you're looking at the purl side, the wrong side, and then just put your tapestry needle through a few of the stitches. Not many, because we're still going to use this thread. We're not going to cut it or anything, so it doesn't need to be super secure, but it's just to keep it out of the way. And then when you pull on that, because you've pulled it through a few stitches here, it doesn't automatically come loose again. And now what you've ended up with is something that vaguely looks like a heart shape now. You've got one half of the curve done here. We've got a line of increases here and then decreases here, and the same on the outer edge here and the same on the side here. So it does kind of curl in on itself a little bit, and that's because this edge here is actually going to be folded backwards on itself around the back to make our heart shape. So the next thing to do is to do the other half, the bit that is on our stitch marker. So if you take a knitting needle, you can reverse what you did before. So unclip it there, and then shuffle them along to the end. It's a little bit like what we've just done with the darning needle, I suppose, and then just flick each one onto this needle. Okay, and what you should end up with is your knitting needle loaded back into those stitches. So I've discarded the stitch holder over there somewhere. I should have said this at the beginning. The pattern does tell you that you should be ready to purl. So what I mean by that is this needle that you're loading your stitches onto is going to become your left-hand needle for you to do the next row. So you need to make sure that you've got the wrong side or the purl side facing you when you do this. So if you're holding it in your left hand as if you're about to knit with it, you need to be looking at the purl side of the work. So when you purl along here, you're doing it the right way around. Fortunately, that's what I've done. So now we are ready to start knitting, or purling in this case. Now the only thing that's missing here, you'll notice, is when we normally knit, we've got a bit of working yarn trailing away to the side here for us to work with, and we don't have that because we used it for the other side. So what we are going to need to do is start off a new piece of wool to do this with. So I've got my other needle here, and we're going to purl. So I'm going to put my needle into this first stitch as if I'm going to purl. And normally I'd be wrapping my working yarn around this needle and purling through. I don't have any working yarn, so I'm just going to have to make my own. So here's the bit that I cut off the ball earlier. This is attached to the ball, and we are going to put a loop just like this, nothing special, just loops around onto our working needle. Use your left hand to hold onto it a little bit so it doesn't start moving about, and then pull it through and purl. That's it. It's a little bit loose because it's not attached to anything, but as you go along that will get better. And then we just purl as normal. It will remain a little bit loose. As you go along it'll get better and feel a bit more normal. What you will have to watch out for is when you come back along the other side, when you're knitting, is when you get back to the end, when you start to approach the stitches that you made with this bit of free working yarn, they will start to feel a little bit loose. So just be careful you don't pull it back through. So once we've purled all the way along this side of the work, we're going to go back to the pattern and then see where we're going next. And I will join you there. Okay, so I have gone up the other side now, following exactly the same pattern as I did for the first side that I did, and I've pulled through to cast off at the top, which is why it's all gathered together like this. I haven't cut the tail off. In projects like this where I'm going to be sewing pieces together, I never do unless I'm very sure I'm not going to need it, because it's useful to have a long piece of thread here to sew things together rather than having to add a new one. So you can see we've got a heart shape now, although it's a bit puffy and it won't really lie flat. And that's because of how many increases and decreases we've done in each section. And this is intentional because we're not going to leave it like this. The idea is that we're going to fold over these edges here and meet at the back, like that. Obviously it'll look a lot better when I've actually sewn it together, but that's the idea, is the back edges will be sewn together and you'll end up with something like this. So now we're going to start sewing it together. What I've done here is I've taken one of these tails from when we did the cast off at the top and I've threaded it onto my needle. What I've also done is I've attempted to turn this sort of inside out. So the knit side is here on the inside, and then on the outside here I've got the purl side. I'm doing it that way just because I think it looks a little bit neater. When you turn it right way around again, it'll look a little bit neater because the stitches will be on the inside. So you might have to persevere with this a little bit. I mean, mine's a little bit puffy. This is the second one I've done, and I think the first one was actually a bit better. I don't know if it's the wool I've used, perhaps. But what you want to try and do is just fold it as best you can into the shape that it's intended to be once it's finished, but obviously it's inside out. So what I've got here is the tail of the cast off that we did at the top of this arch. I've put it back onto my needle, and what I intend to do with this is to stitch along this top edge, to sew these two edges together into the point where the heart has an indent here, and then I'm going to sew down the back. I'm going to sew the two edges together like that, and then what will be left is this bit here will still be open. I'm going to use one of the other threads, probably this one, to do that with. I'll come back and do that later. So the way we do this is you just hold the knitting in place as best as you can, and then how I tend to do it is I will loop the thread in and out of the edge of the stitches like this. So I will just make sure the needle goes in one side and then the other side and then pull it through. Doesn't have to be terribly neat, I don't think. So I'm just going to make sure the needle goes through one side and then the other side. Just lightly. We don't want to go really deep because we don't want that much of a seam on the inside, because otherwise you're just wasting your knitting. And then I'll just do another one here at the point. There we are. So now this edge doesn't look terribly tidy. I've not done a great job of that, but that's now stuck together. And then I'm going to, in fact, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the other top edge before I go down the back, and that might be the easiest thing to do. 1 second, I'll just go and thread my needle. So we've got quite a lot of threads hanging off from this, so it's not always easy to tell. This is the tail of when I did the cast off on the other side at the top here. So again, I'm going to use this to stitch the top edges I should say, together to make a heart shape. I'm just going to make sure I've gone in one edge and out the other, to make sure that the two edges are attached together. I have not done a very neat job of this, so it's a little bit messy. It isn't the neatest I've ever made. The pink one I showed you at the beginning I think was a bit neater than this, but never mind. Alright, we're nearly at the middle. Oops. Nearly that. There we are. So now my top edges have all been sewn together. I'm hoping it's going to look a bit neater when I turn it the right way in. This is partly why I like to do it inside out, so if you do happen to have a little bit of a messy edge, this is going to be on the inside. So remember, I have turned this inside out, so what we're looking at here on the outside here is actually going to be the inside of the heart. It's the purl edge, the purl side I should say. Okay, and then we're going to go down the back seam in just the same way. We're going to make sure we've gone into the edge stitches on both sides with the thread. This is a much neater edge because it's not a cast on or cast off edge. This is just the edge of the end of each row, and it's a little bit neater, so you might have an easier time of finding which stitches you're supposed to sew here. So I'm just methodically going down. I'm trying to make sure I'm just doing one stitch on one side and one stitch on the other one there and one there. I'm trying to make sure I use each one exactly once and they match up with each other so that when I get to the end they're evenly pressed together and I've not done too many on one side and too few on the other, and it'll be only even. You want to do this relatively tightly. You don't want it to be puckering on itself, but you do want it to hold together because we're going to put stuffing in it, and in my case I'm going to put polystyrene balls in it, which if I've got holes in my knitting will just fall out. That's a safety risk if nothing else. You're a little bit safer if you've got any toy stuffing or cotton wool because that won't tend to come out. So I'm nearly there. Just good because I'm running out of thread. There. Right, we don't want to go all the way down because we're going to be turning this inside out and stuffing it. So I've left a hole there. I can just about get my thumb into that, so I've left that. I'm just going to take my needle off. And then this is the moment of truth. This is when I'm going to turn it the right way in. This is where I find out that my hole is too small and I can't get it in. There we go, we're making some progress. So I want to turn it so all the knit sides are facing outwards. I've left myself with not a terribly big hole, so that I've made that a little bit awkward. It's like turning a sock inside out. There we go. There we are. So make sure that you've pulled out any bits that might have been tucked in on themselves, like the corners of a pillowcase. And there you have it. That does look a lot neater now. I've turned it the right way in. So we've got a hole at the bottom, which is where we're going to put our stuffing, and then we're going to sew it up on the outside. This is the front, so this is the bit that doesn't have the seam down the middle. And now I'm quite glad I did it the wrong way in, because now it's a lot neater around the top. And then this is where the seam is. Someone much better at sewing than I am would probably have made that look almost seamless, but I haven't. There is a seam. It's fine. So now you can stuff it with your choice of stuffing. If you're using something like toy stuffing or cotton wool, you may want to leave yourself a bigger gap than that. I should probably have left myself a bigger gap than that, but it's fine. So I'm now going to stuff that with my polystyrene balls, and then I'm going to thread one of these many threads with a needle. What might be an idea at this point is to tuck the rest of these in, because nobody's going to be accessing the inside of this heart once you've stuffed it and sewn it up. So there's not really any need to tuck these in very neatly. So maybe just choose a nice long one for you to be sewing up with, and the rest you can just stuff inside like this. Sort of out of sight, out of mind. Because nobody's going to see them, and nobody's going to be, accessing them to pull them about and things. So you couldn't do something like this if you were doing an item of clothing. You'd need to be a bit more fastidious about sewing these in and keeping them tidy. But because this is going on the inside where nobody's going to be accessing it or playing with it, then they're okay to just tuck inside like that. Alright, so now I've just got one thread, and I'm going to use that to sew it all up at the end. I'm going to go and stuff this, and then I'll quickly sew it up, and then we're at the end. Okay, so here you can see I have stuffed my heart with some polystyrene balls. Try not to overstuff, you don't want it to all be spilling out. And then I've just threaded up this needle, thread with a needle, and then I'm just going to sew around the bottom in the same way that we did before. I'm going to try to make this a little bit neater because this is the outside. This is the bit that people are going to be able to see. And you want to make sure you're doing your stitches nice and densely. You want to be ensuring that there's no gaps, that the stuffing that you've just so lovingly put in your heart is going to come spilling out again. We're there. Yeah, it's not the neatest thing in the world, but yeah, there we are. We've made a heart. I hope you've enjoyed following this video along. It was a little bit longer than some of our usual ones, but I think it was worth it. We've had a go at going through a knitting pattern together for the first time. We've become familiar with some of the abbreviations and other things that will pop up in knitting patterns. And I hope this gives you the confidence to have a go at your own knitting projects, whether it's these simple hearts or whether you've found another pattern that you'd like to have a go at. Thanks very much, stay safe, and I will see you soon.